Right, so we're going to go over how to get an A or A star in an A-level breadth essay for history. This is particularly the British unit talking about popular protest and the government's reaction to such protest in the period of 1780 to 1820. But the rest of the course is going to go over the Reform Crisis, the Three Reform Acts, and other protests in the period, such as the People's Charter that happened just after this. So if you want to get into the band 5 or 6, you're going to have to cover the entire period displayed in the question. It'll come at the end, and for the first half of your term, it'll probably be about 1780 to 1820 for popular protest, because you then move on to talking about the reform period in the 1830s and the passing of the 1832 Great Reform Act under Earl Grey's administration, introduced by Lord John Russell. So, you're going to have to write one paragraph for each decade, roughly about 0.6 of a page, so just over half. It seems like a lot, but it's fairly achievable. Obviously, no, don't just describe the history, you have to relate it directly to the question remarked. So, you may have some knowledge about Luddism, but don't just describe it blatantly. So, if the question were to talk about the matter of parliamentary protest being driven by political ideology, you would relate Luddism to the fact that it was, well, essentially an ideology in itself, kind of staunchly conservative and opposed to any sort of change. So partially driven by ideology and partially driven by poverty induced by the Industrial Revolution. Make sure to directly state how the events you have discussed in each paragraph answer the question. This is basically just a mini conclusion in each paragraph. If you want to get the higher bands, you have to remember though, don't always put it at the end of the paragraph because they will mark you down for this. It can be easily fixed. Sometimes put how the information pertains to the question at the beginning, in the middle. It's not very hard. So write 3 to 4 pages for a 30-mark essay. They'll give you about an hour to do this. It seems like a lot, but it's not when you're in there, because obviously you've got adrenaline and stuff. Make sure you include as many historical events as you can for each decade. You need to do this pretty much because it bulks out your essay, and providing you've remembered them all and you have all the dates, it puts you in the higher bands. And obviously you're definitely going to have covered the entire period. If you're going to do this, I highly recommend summarizing all the periods into an acronym like the one we have on the next slide. So basically just take the first letter of each of these events and put them into short words to help you remember. So these are the things we are going to be covering, the main events. In this lesson we're only going to be going over the first two, because that will cover the 1780s and some other relevant stuff that isn't included in the British spec, but you can include it in the essay and it will just get you those high marks. It shows you've done independent research. So we're going to be going over the Gordon riots and the French Revolution. Going over the rest of them in the future for the 1790s, 1800s, 1810s and 1820s. So we're going to do the Gordon riots, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So the Gordon riot started in 1780 by staunch Protestants who opposed William Pitt the Younger's Catholic Relief Bill, which he introduced to Parliament. This was when Pitt was still fairly liberal in his reforming side. The Gordon riots have been fairly compared to the 2011 London riots, and they're essentially mass arson taking place throughout London, partially inspired by Pitt's Catholic Relief Bill, partially a result of Protestants believing that England had sort of degenerated and God was punishing them. Obviously, you have to remember just about 100 years earlier, you had 1666 and the Great Fire of London and the English Civil War, so certainly a turbulent time. So it came about as a result of deep-seated anti-Catholic sentiments. This theme that will permeate the period, so you have to remember 1688, William of Orange comes over, you've got the Billy Boys, who essentially support William of Orange, that's why they're called Billy Boys if you didn't know. Pretty much the Catholics were perceived to be less loyal, and obviously you have to remember James II was deposed for being a Catholic, so people weren't too thrilled about the idea of having Catholics in power or having political representation. Eventually crushed by the army, the government's response can be criticised as they did not respond very swiftly. However, it could be argued that the government couldn't really, because the Protestants who were rioting were staunch loyalists, because obviously Protestants support the Church of England, which is a English institution, so they can easily be controlled. So the government's in a lot of trouble if it starts messing with its supporters. The American Revolution. Many British people detested the war as they perceived it as Englishmen killing Englishmen. This is a similar theme to the one you'll come across if you're doing the Germany unit. I believe it was Hans von Seeckt in the Kaput who said, Reichswehr sich nicht auf Reichswehr, Reichswehr troops do not shoot on Reichswehr troops. Basically, honour amongst the army, and the populace tend to not like this kind of betrayal as it degenerates the honour of the institution. So the attitudes of deference towards the monarchy and the divine right of kings was further diminished, obviously because the American colonists were establishing a republic with a president and had now left George III. So this challenges the divine right of kings that had hitherto been the precedent of governments at the time. If you're interested, Thomas Hobbes says a lot about this in his book Leviathan. It's very interesting. I'd also recommend Edmund Burke for further reading. Obviously, the American Revolution's motto, no taxation without representation, could be challenged considering the fact that American colonists were taxed less than English citizens. So that could be an argument for the government not really deserving the blame for the revolution. I think it was partially inspired predominantly by the American upper and middle classes who were the main ones suffering from the taxes. You have to think Stamp Act, Sugar Acts, the working class aren't really going to be buying paper very often, and most of them probably couldn't afford sugar, so that's just something to keep in mind. So I've just reiterated there, partially result of poor government treatment of colonists, Stamp Act, Sugar Acts, Tea Acts, Townshend Acts, 1776, a great musical on the period if you're interested. Ultimately, the American Revolution was dealt with poorly by the government and started due to both political ideology of Americans, as classical liberalism was taking foot in the time. I know Thomas Paine's book Common Sense was popular among many of the Americans, and obviously you've got the classical liberal ideas from Locke and the likes permeating their society, and many of their thinkers, such as John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. Locke's second treatise of government, particularly, very evident in their work if you've ever read the Constitution or anything by Jefferson or Adams. And you also have to think about the way the government dealt with events such as the Boston Massacre, although I would argue that's not really the government's fault or the British fault. And obviously, if you know anything about it, John Adams famously defended the British soldiers who were to be executed. Fortunately, they did not. So, have a look at that if you're interested. Finally, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, mechanized spinning machines, and the expansion of the textile industry. So the proliferation of industrial working class and poor working conditions. So this relates to poverty. Obviously, you've got Henry Hunt saying poverty born of despair. Sorry, violence born of despair. So if you're going to be arguing about popular protests, what were their main cause? Was it political? Was it due to poor economic decisions? Was it due to poverty? The Industrial Revolution certainly played a role to poor living conditions, although ultimately a good thing. You have to think about initially when you're industrializing a nation and processes are developing, you're going to have a lot of pollution in the initial stage, and obviously that's been seen in the world at the moment. Another thing that you have to remember, the introduction of new money in the form of self-made industrialists who essentially were working class men, came up with an invention, sold it for a lot of money, became very wealthy. An example I can think of is George Stephenson, the inventor of the rocket, the first train. Very exciting. I believe that was 1829. But the main important thing you have to take from that is that most of these new money industrialists voted Whig, which was not very good for the Tory party at the time, so they weren't conservatives until 1846. The poverty and poor living conditions caused by the industrialization resulted in some discontent amongst the urban working class, culminating in the Luddite movement and the March of the Blanketeers in the 1810s. So that's another thing. If you're going to be talking about poverty, and you're going to argue that poverty was the driving force of popular protest in the period and not political factors, it would be good to bridge the paragraphs of the different decades, and probably at the end of your paragraph on the 1780s or whatever, you could relate the rising industrialization, so like the introduction of mechanized textile production, relate that to future protests like the 1817 March of the Blanketeers or the Luddite disturbances of 1811 to 1816, as these were both predominantly in these industrialized areas where textile industry was a key part of the local economy, particularly the March of the Blanketeers, as I believe that was the Lancashire textile mills, who went to go and petition Parliament for better treatment. So, we also have the French Revolution. Obviously, this also diminished the power of the monarchy and expanded republican ideals. We've got Robespierre there. with his head. It alienated many Christians from the radical cause when the cult of reason was established in France. So essentially, they abolished the traditional church and replaced it with a secular one that viewed Robespierre as some kind of divine being. In my opinion, utter nonsense, but I believe there's an oversimplified video talking about the French Revolution. He explains it in more detail if you're interested. Further reading is always advised. Obviously, Robespierre's reign of terror made the government fear radicals and repress them. Because obviously, you've got to think, if you're one of the upper class at this time, if you see all the working class in France rising up, and obviously the reign of terror, 1793, they execute the monarchy, they execute famous scientists like Antoine Lavoisier and other key figures, Marie Antoinette, not good. And obviously it inspired the English radicals to demand reform. Next lesson, the 1790s, we're going to go over the LCS, the London Corresponding Society, the naval mutinies, the United Societies and United Irishmen, and their battle against popular loyalism and the propaganda campaign produced by the government. And we are going to go over Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, both Volumes 1 and Volume 2. See you then.